Hey, I'm EVYATAR. I'm a front-end engineer at Facebook, and I'm the author of Jest. Jest is a form validations framework inspired by unit testing libraries like Mocha or Jest. So if you've done even a little unit testing in your career, I think you'll feel very much at home working with Jest. Today, I want to show you how we can use Jest to improve the way we write form validations in our Vue apps. But before I start speaking about Jest itself, I want to mention a little the motivation behind Jest and what led me to write Jest to begin with. In my experience writing forms and validating forms before using Jest, I had a big problem of lacking structure. So I was trying to add validations to the form, and I wasn't sure where I should put the validation logic. Should I put them inside the change handlers? Should I put them somewhere in my feature in a shared library? How do I write it? How do I avoid it being too specific to my feature? And there is no any specific structure that the validations should follow. So I ended up making it work by writing it somewhere in between my handlers and my feature. But then when I wanted to make changes and maintain the feature, like adding more fields in the future or making fields depend on one another or even removing a field, it was very, very hard because everything was tied down to the feature. And because everything is very specific to the feature, it was very hard as well to make use of again. So to take it and use it in a different form or a different feature, like the password field in both reset password and sign in. Um, so all these led me to think of a solution. And a couple of years back, when I was working with a previous employer, we just started writing unit tests for our apps. And I saw that patterns that unit tests have, that we have a testing suite with describes and its and expects, and it looked very similar to the way I was thinking about form validation in my mind. Because unit tests are declarative by nature, so you are able to describe exactly what you want happen, and along with that, they are very good at expressing what's there compared to how it should be. So you put a function in a test, and the same goes for form validation. So I want my values, my data, to run through some tests, and it all seems very relevant to the world of form validation. Of course, it's not exactly the same, and the terminology is different, and we don't run unit tests in production. But with some design adjustments, I was able to come up with something that's still very similar to the way we write unit tests and still be very relevant for form validation. And the structure I came up with is this. We first create a suite that's separate from our feature code, and add a callback to it. Inside the callback, we add our tests, similar to unit test tests, with an extra field or an extra parameter, which is the name of the field that we're validating. So in this case, we have test, and we're testing that username, and then we have the error that the user will get in case of a validation failure. So username must be at least 3 characters. And inside the callback of that test, we have our assertions. So similar to assert or expect, we enforce that data.username is longer than 2 or whatever validation we have there. And I want to show you how it works with a real live Vue app. And just note, I'm using here the options API, but it could work with the composition API just as well. No changes whatsoever to the best code. So this is our app. It's a very basic app without any validation at all yet. And I added some input components that are there just for styling. I added a few class names. So I added a class name for error. That turns it red. Let me just refresh. Okay, it turns it red. I added a class name for warning that turns it orange, and one for success that turns it green. And along with that, I also added a few props. So one for errors, and it takes an array of strings, and when displayed, it shows the error on the field, and same for warnings. I also added a loading spinner because we're going to do some async validations later down the line. So loading true. And we're going to see a spinner. So that's all we have already here. We also have the validate function, which is empty. It takes the name and the value from the field that we're validating. And let's create our suite. So source, and let's import create from Vest. Now I'll do const suite equals create. And I'll export default that suite. So export default suite. Now import this suite into my form. So import suite from suite. And I'll use it inside my validate function. So suite, and I'll call it. Now I'll store the validation result in our data. So res equals suite.get. And I'll also update it whenever there's a change in the validate function. So this.res equals the result from suite. And let's take the value and the name and also pass down the this.input. So let's pass everything and the name of the field that we're validating. Back to the suite, let's write our first test. So first, let's take the data, which is empty at the moment. And let's take test and enforce. Now, writing the first test is very simple. Let's test that username and say that if it fails, the user will say username is required. And then enforce that data.username is not empty. And if I go back to the form and I already have this here, I'll just go to the input and do errors equals, and then res dot get errors for the field username. And if I start typing and then remove everything, I'll see that username is required, which is what we wrote. Let's duplicate this for password as well, and let's go to write the rest of our test. So another one for username, and we can have multiple tests for the same field, and they do not have to be in the same function, which makes it very easy to understand what's going on. So username must be at least 3 characters long, longer than 2. Let's do the same for password. And let's say that password must be at least 5 characters, so longer than or equals 5. And now if I refresh and start typing, we'll see that we get the validation message for username and also for password. Now, if you noticed it, the password field starts lighting up whenever I type inside username, which is not the expected result. We actually want it to only fire up for itself. And this is really easy. Let's just import only. And only allows us to specify the fields that we want to be validated at any given time. So let's run only. And remember, we're passing the name of the field that we're validating to the suite. We can take it here, current field, and let's pass it to only. And now whenever I type inside any of the fields, only it will light up. Now let's add some color. Vest is not a UI framework, but it does give you some UI utilities so you can style your app. So let's do import class names from Vest class names. And what the class names utility does is it gives you an ability to specify which class names should appear in which validation state. So I'll do a computed value and I'll return class names and pass it the validation result, and also the classes that I want to appear at any stage. So if it's valid, I want it to be success. And if it's invalid, I want it to be error. And if it's warning, I want it to be warning. So I can take now the class names and put it in the class. So class equals CN, that's our property, with the field username. And if I start typing, we'll see that it's red and then it's green. So let's do the same for password. And this is happening the same. Now, what if we want some warning fields? So for example, password strength shouldn't block the field from the form from submitting, but it should notify the user there's a problem. Let's do it. We have the feature of warning validations. We just have to call the warn function from Jest. So let's test that password. And let's say that it's weak, that it has no numbers. Password is weak. Maybe add a number. And let's do matches, which takes a regular expression. And let's do, it has 0 to 9 in it. And now all I have to do is just add warn to it, which says this is a warning field. And as I type, you'll see that after 5 characters, it becomes orange, but we're not seeing the validation message. And this is because we're only taking the validation errors. So we have to duplicate this and say get warnings. And if I start typing now, password is weak, maybe add a number. Cool. Now, sometimes we want to also have async validations. For example, if the username is already taken, we want to check that instead of letting the user submit and only then tell them. And all we have to do in Jest is just return a promise or an async test inside our suite. So I'll just do it. Let's have a mock function that implements does user exist logic. So async function does user exist. It takes a username. And if the username equals some user, we should throw an error. Throw new error. And also let's make it wait for a second. I'll get the wait npm package. So wait for 1 second. And all I have to do now is write a test that returns does user exist. So test username. Username already taken. And I just need to return does user exist and call it with data.username. Now, if I start typing here, some user, you'll notice that nothing happens. And this is because Jest needs to report back to the form that the validation completed. And here it's waiting for a second. So all we have to do, and maybe first let's add a spinner so we know what's going on. Let's add a new data property. So username loading equals false. This is the default. And now let's do if name. So if the field that we're validating is username, let's do this dot username is loading equals to true. And now just to make it work, let's do loading equals to username is loading. So just to see, okay, we have the spinner and now we need to cancel it when the validation completes. So let's do this dot done. Oh, this dot res dot done. Done is a function that gives us a callback when the validation is complete. And all we have to do is this.res equals suite.get gives us the current validation result. And also let's cancel username is loading. So this.username loading equals false. So now if I type some user, we're supposed to get username is already taken. And that's it. That's all you have to do for async validation. But of course, it can be improved, because if you notice, you'll see that I start typing, and even though the validation is failing for the shorter validation, for example, the must be at least 3 characters, we're still showing the spinner, which means we're still going out to the server, which is not a great idea because it could be a very costly async validation. And to prevent that, we can just tell Vest to skip a validation upon some criteria. In this case, whenever the validation is failing to begin with. So in our case, let's get skip when from Vest, and it allows us to tell whenever we want to skip something. And we're taking skip when, and our criteria is suite.get, which gives us the validation result, has errors for username. So whenever username is failing, don't run whatever's inside that callback. And if I do this, okay, let's try typing something. E, A, no spinner. L, there's a spinner. So we're not validating the async validation before it's ready. Now let's do some user again. And it's correct. But now I'm adding another character. And we went to the server and now it's valid. And I'll remove it. And we went to the server again, even though we do know that the validation is already failing because we've already seen it failing for the same user. And again, it could be a costly validation. And we can handle it with memoization within Vest. And all we have to do is take our test and do test.memo, and then just add our dependencies. So in our case, we want to memoize it by the username. So data.username. So as long as username doesn't change, or as long as username is repeated, the validation will give us immediately the same response without going to the server. And this is the example. So some user, we're going to the server, I'm adding a character, and if I remove it, you'll see that we got an immediate response. And now you'll see that the form is valid, everything is okay. I just want to add one more thing. I want to disable submission before the form is fully valid. And this is easy to do. All we have to do is go to our template again, and then add disable to our submit button, and say we want to disable when res is not valid. So not res is valid. And let me see. Oh, disabled. Okay. And now it's disabled. And if I write something, some user 1, perfect, and password example 1, and just notice it, warning does not prevent the form from submission. A warning field does not qualify for invalid, which is just what we're after. And just like that, within, I think, 6 lines of logic within Vue, we were able to validate this form completely with many, many complex validations, which is pretty awesome, I think. And we've seen some of the features that Vest has, but not all of them. There are a few more, and there are validation of changed fields upon interaction, which we've done. Multiple validations per field, warning validations. We can have interdependent field validations, so we can have tests that's dependent on one another. We have async validations, and we can also memoize them. We can group tests and nest tests within groups. For example, when we have a multi-step form. And in general, we have structured validations. These are some of Vest features, but not all of them. And even with all those features and all this complexity, Vest is still less than 6 kilobytes when minizipped. And I think it makes Vest one of the smaller yet most powerful validation frameworks out there. and I am really excited working about Vest. I enjoy writing form validations with Vest. I thank you for joining me today. If you're excited about Vest today, feel free to ping me on Twitter, or even go to the GitHub page, or even submit a PR improving the docs for Vue, or even improving and adding some code. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining me today. Have a great day.